nurses. We are here today. We are going to talk about a question. How do I stay true to my values as a nurse leader while I progress? Staying true to yourself requires identity. Identifying your core values, most authentic leaders who maintain a strong sense of alignment have a core set of 3 to 5 values that they commit to not compromising on. For me, it means keeping the frontline perspective as part of that. I have to monitor my mindset to the fact that I am changing my proximity to the frontline without abandoning the frontline, because that is really important to me. How about you?
Hey, I'm Cindy,
And I'm Taresa.
and we are both master's prepared nurse leaders who are on a journey to help others not have to make the same mistakes that we have seen and experienced ourselves. We are on a mission to elevating nurse leaders to create dynamic and high-performing and cohesive teams that will lead to improved outcomes and happier staff.
Identify your values. This isn't something that anyone else can really do for you. So it's one of those things that's kind of challenging. Like, everybody has their own journey to figure that out. So you can do this by yourself through careful reflection. You can do it with a therapist using like a values worksheet or books. If you need help with this, we can help point you in a direction. And we're going to talk about how we identified our values as other ways to kind of go through that.
Yeah. So some thoughts we have about this are that you might want to spend some structured time really evaluating this. You can go online and look up how to find my values, and you'll get lists of potential, just words. And sometimes it's nice to just look through those lists of words and say what stands out to me, that this is an important thing for me, and that's something that I recognize, that is something that I want to hone in on. You might hold listening rounds and you're actually listening. So, like, what are other people saying? What's standing out to you when they're talking? Does somebody say create an emotional reaction in you, either negative or positive? That might be a clue.
Yeah, you could even ask other people or staff, what's one thing I should know before I make a decision, so that they can give you more information. So when you're making decisions, you're keeping your decisions in alignment with your values, which for me, again, one of them is keeping the frontline perspective. So that's kind of why that question popped back up. Bring frontline stories to executive rooms where they're often missing. That's another way to help me maintain that alignment. So that's kind of what I am doing when I say things like that. So we're going to run through a couple of examples of values. So for example, if you have values that include something like compassion, safety, recognition, leadership lets you scale these values so they can get bigger and look different. So instead of comforting one nurse, you build a culture where everyone feels supported, because compassion is one of your values, right? Does that make sense? Instead of fixing one workflow, you redesign an entire system so it doesn't break again, so that patients are safer and they have improved outcomes. So these are some of the why behind, like, why identifying your values might be important, but it's also adds value and shows you what you can do with staying true to your values. For example, instead of advocating for one patient, you influence policies that protect thousands. So these are big ways that you can do this. By doing these things, you're not moving away from impact, you're multiplying it. Because a lot of times I've heard this thing, like, as you get further and further away from the bedside, you lose your perspective, when your goal might be to keep that perspective, right? So those are the reasons I'm kind of like going back to that.
Yeah. So there's a phrase that's out there that says you're going to behave like the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And that is really kind of a true statement. You're going to mirror the behavior of whoever you're surrounded by. And so one way to stay true to your values is to surround yourself with the people that have the similar values, or will uphold your values. I can tell when Taresa is not feeling good about herself and she feels like she's fallen off of her authentic lead, and I can kind of say, hey, I wonder if you are not being true to yourself right now. Have you broken one of your own values? And she might be like, oh, maybe I did, and I probably need to redirect that at this point.
Yeah. Some other examples of staying true to your values that you might like, things that you're going to face or experience, are things like saying no when it's not popular. The rest of the room thinks this idea is the greatest idea on the planet, and you have to like say no to stay true to your values, because it may be leaning away from that compassion or leaning away from that safety plan that you really, really truly to your core think is important.
Mm-hmm.
Slowing down decisions that feel rushed. This is, I think, something that Cindy is actually really good at. Cindy, can you give us some examples of that? Because I feel like this is something that I think you have done well, even just slowing things down. Or one of the things Cindy does is pause and say, how did we get here?
Mm. Yeah. I think that it's good. What I always ask whenever something unfortunate happens is I try to think about what got us here in the first place. And I don't want to just jump to the conclusion of, I think it's that person's fault, or I knew this was going to happen because whatever. I really try to put my judgment aside and get curious about that and say, what was the sequence of events that led us to this place? Um, I think, for an example, I've had so as a supervisor, you will often get people that will come and complain about things to you. Sometimes you get providers that will come in and complain about a nurse that you're supervising, and they'll say, this nurse did this thing and it was super incorrect and wrong. So, one example I had with this was I had a doctor email me and said that I had a nurse who I was supervising. They felt that that nurse had been really disrespectful to the provider because the nurse kept bothering them all night long. Now, we were working in an ICU. We had very critical patients and we were a teaching hospital. So we had residents who were learning and growing, but they didn't always know all the answers. And our nurses actually had some continuity with these patients. They knew their systems and they knew when they felt like there was an unsafe situation. Now, this nurse may have not communicated in a way that the provider felt heard, but instead of just jumping to a conclusion and being like, hey, that nurse was inappropriate and immediately go to a disciplinary pathway, I decided to go into the chart and I looked at the documentation, and this nurse had documented very well what was going on, and he had documented all the conversations that they'd had with the nurse. And then I talked to the nurse the next day, and it turned out that this patient had been having his blood pressure had been continuing to drop all night long, and he didn't have an arterial line, and he was on one vasopressor. And vasopressor is something that tightens up the vessels so that you can keep the blood going to the vital organs when you're maybe septic or something, bleeding, something else is going on. But his intervention, he didn't feel like was working because he was watching the blood pressure go down and he kept having to raise his rate. And every time this happened, he'd go into the provider room and he'd say, this system isn't working. I think we either need to add another med, or maybe we need to put an art line in, or maybe we need to call somebody else. And the provider would come in the room and he would look at the monitor, and the monitor would say the blood pressure with it was within normal range. But he wasn't acknowledging the fact that that was because the medication dose was going higher and higher and higher all night long. And so at the end of the day, I realized that this nurse had actually been advocating for the patient for safety. And he was getting frustrated because he was feeling scared, because he was going in to talk to this provider to say, I need you to do something for me. And he didn't feel like he was being heard. And so I ended up doing some coaching on both sides at the end of this. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't take a minute to go dive into like what actually happened, to see both sides of the stories and realize there was some opportunities on both sides. There was some communication opportunities.
Right. So that's a perfect example of not rushing into a decision when people are like, you need to handle this situation. You need to do something about this person or this X, Y, and Z or this situation or whatever. So that's an example of adhering to your values. A couple of things. Another one that she actually kind of touched on by this is protecting your staff, even when it creates friction. So by slowing that decision down, that might have created some friction because now the physicians are kind of like getting like, oh, wait a minute, you're not handling this situation. And so they're like, what, why? So there's that. And then another one, if your value is inclusion or belonging, so something like that, another one might be naming inequities when others ignored those inequities, kind of calling things out as you see it. One other thing I wanted to bring up that I thought about is the fact that if you asked this question, how do I stay true to my values as a nurse leader while I progress? One of your values is likely going to be courage, bravery, or integrity. The reason is because people don't ask these questions if they're not concerned, if they're doing the right thing. And
if you're not being challenged, if you're not putting yourself in situations that challenge you, you're not going to be asking those questions either.
And if you're asking that question, you're not able you're concerned that you're not, meaning you're going to have to do hard things, and that means saying the uncomfortable thing.
Hmm.
That means it requires bravery, courage, or integrity. Those are just a few examples of values that are in alignment with asking those questions.
Yeah.
But values are never tested on your easy days, just like Cindy just said.
Yeah.
So how did we identify our values? We both have had a pathway,
Hmm.
slightly different. So we're both going to share our experiences in identifying our own values. And that way, maybe it'll be clue you in on some steps to take if you haven't identified them, if you've never even considered that as a thing to be concerned about. But here we are.
So I think, Teresa was saying maybe you've never considered this. I don't think that I really put a lot of thought into my values until I was well into my adulthood, probably maybe around when I was just going into leadership. I don't think that and I was just sort of like living in a reactive state in my life where I was going from one event to another and I didn't really know why I ended up where I did. Um, but I think after I ended up in some unfortunate situations, one of the things that stood out to me was certain things that would happen to me or certain ways that people would treat me would make me feel, give me a lot of distress.
Hmm.
So, one example was I experienced a relationship with somebody who lied to me a lot. And I then developed a core value, or I realized I had a core value that honesty was super important to me. And so, I realized that that wouldn't have bothered me as much in that situation if that wasn't a value to me. So that helped me recognize that. And then I also, I'm a person that has been on a journey of trying to fix my own issues and like own up my own stuff. And so I've been to a lot of therapy and I have had therapists that, gave me a list of cards and they were like, pick out the ones that stand out to you. So I've kind of done it in a combination of those ways. But I think similar to Teresa, my values are keeping the frontline perspective as well. And then I would add that honesty, I will appreciate somebody who can own up to a mistake that they made well more than somebody who always performs perfectly, but then maybe hides something from me when they don't want me to know about it.
Mm.
That causes me to lose respect immediately. And I will have a really hard time rebuilding that relationship after that fact. Another thing that I really care about is I'm passionate about mentorship and I'm passionate about building other people up. And I'm also passionate about, I think, also inclusivity. When I was a new nurse, I was also a victim of some nurse bullying
Mm.
and some of that eat your young behavior, and it didn't feel good. And instead of saying, well, I'm just going to turn around and do that to the next generation, I decided that I wanted to be different and I wanted to create a better environment for people around me who didn't have to feel ashamed and small. I wanted to empower people to be their best selves. So inclusion's a huge one for me as well.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, definitely. So, how I identified my values, I had an experience way back in high school. I took a class that kind of went through some of this, which I think is a really cool class for a high school kid to take. And
For
maybe
sure.
more people should do that, or it should be offered more often. But we went through an exercise where we talked about values and identified them. And then I kind of went into adulthood and kind of did the same thing, got into autopilot a little bit and didn't really consider it. But then as I was growing and developing myself, I realized, I have some things I could work on and things I could do better, and I could change the way I see the world. So I was dating someone, again, relationships, I think, often bring this up more often than anything, but because you want to have better relationships. How do I do that? How do I make things better? As you get older, we're humans, we're curious usually by nature. So some of a partner had given me a list of values and it was pages and pages. And so I like combed through all of them. And I think I circled or highlighted a whole bunch at first and then kind of just kept going through the list and identifying things that stood out to me or spoke to me or felt like something that was deeper. And then again, I later again did it with a therapist to review and make sure I was living those and in alignment with them, or why am I seeing my therapist and what's going on right now? That type of stuff.
It's kind of interesting to revisit it multiple times in your life too, to say, are these values changing or have I developed new values? I think most of us probably see that there's a consistent one. And if it is showing up multiple times throughout your life, that's probably a core value.
Yes.
It's not just a nice to have. This is like a deal breaker. If somebody behaves this way around me, like we can't move forward. We don't pass go.
Yeah.
you know?
I have there. So again, like we were talking, there's usually a typical 3 core values that everyone has that typically won't change throughout your life once you're developed in as an adult. Maybe when you're younger, that might shift a little. Experiences might shift that slightly, but overall, going to be good.
Yeah.
But so we wanted to share this information with you. How do you stay true to your values? It's courage, bravery. Those are part of it. Thank you so much for joining here on Nurse Leadership Dumpster Fire. Like and subscribe if you want more information, and follow our next video on how to find your way. Thanks.